Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Kelly White. He's co-founder and CEO of Risk Recon, a MasterCard company. Kelly, it's good to have you back.
It's wonderful to be here with you. Thanks for inviting me.
And really, the software supply chain risk management question has really burst on the federal scene in a really big way in the last year or so.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are focusing specifically on the software supply chain risk management issue, one of the more important components of what federal agencies buy. So from your standpoint, what are the issues? What do people need to know about supply chain risk management, especially in the software they buy?
Yeah, it's so important. Software's kind of eaten all aspects of our lives, hasn't it? I can't think of any area where software isn't prevalent and playing an important role in the whatever operations, the control of that operations, the privacy of the related data and so forth. And it spans all aspects, and it's only growing. And the reality is, like it or not, the reality is that our organizations are only, and the underlying processes are only as reliable and safe and as sound as the software itself. We've turned over so many things to software to fulfill tasks and to govern data and so forth that operated in the realm of human control. And, I think that if you draw comparisons, we've had a long time building controls and regulations and so forth around things in the physical world. We have a lot more experience with that. We have tens of thousands of years of building houses, and, it's only in modern times that, regulations have come forward for that. But I think in a lot of cases, we've honestly gotten ahead of ourselves in the deployment of software. It's been great, not arguing that shouldn't be the case, but has the software kept pace with what we're asking the software to do? Have the rules and the governance of that kept pace with what we're asking the software to do? And I think that really strikes to the heart of what rightly the government and other thought leaders and regulators are concerned about.
All right. And so software comes in many forms, and maybe you could just discuss with us what some of the issues people need to pay attention to in the supply chain for, say, custom coded software, where you pay an integrator or pay a company to code an application for you, and versus open source that you might inculcate into some of the work you're doing, or even your contracted coder could be using open source to fill in a lot of the functions it doesn't need to code by hand, versus commercial applications that you use on the web, on the cloud hosting, or simply on your own servers. I mean, these are all different flavors of the same thing.
Yeah. And, a lot of times they all kind of mix together. And so there's not necessarily clean delineation between what's custom, and then you have open source, and then you have commercial. I mean, some of those can all kind of come together in one unit, and probably more commonly do than they don't. And, some things that have happened in the recent past, MOVE-IT, an example that I know hit many federal agencies, along with some of the most respected organizations across the world. That was certainly a software supply chain issue. And then the classic one, I think, that really shed a light on, wow, the magnitude of the challenge that we face here was the SolarWinds issue. And so these really put a bright light on the challenges that we face. Myself, I actually started in cybersecurity in 1997, shortly after graduating from university. And pretty quickly, around 2000, 2001, started into specializing in application security, doing application security reviews, secure development life cycles, and so on. And particularly focused on custom code, custom web applications, and so forth. And there were some great initiatives that came out of that, like the OWASP and the OWASP Top 10, which continues to be very important. And those were really focused on analyzing the code that you're developing, you're writing. You have the source code for it, you're focused on what your engineers are developing. It wasn't until more recently, I think, that we really started thinking critically about the implications of open source software in the whole picture. And then even more recently than that, thinking about the whole software supply chain from the beginning of, starting to write code and the code repositories and the release management and the testing and all of those things and the deployment that makes up that whole cycle. And so there's been this evolution over the last 20 years of how we think about the software supply chain. And it's grown dramatically from, hey, is this free? Is my code free of vulnerabilities like SQL injection, cross-site scripting, buffer overflows, heap overflows, things like that? And really looking at, well, what about all of the components that come into this? And what about the way, how do we ensure the integrity of that software from beginning to end so that at no point, so that we can ensure the integrity of that from, inception all the way out to release and to maintenance releases and operations and so forth. So there's been a dramatic expansion in that. And I think that these things that we're talking about are, when you look at custom code and open source code and commercial code, you'd be hard pressed to find a robust, fairly large, complex custom code application that isn't using open source code. So you have to think about all of these together. And even commercial software uses open source libraries as well. And it can also then, there can be commonly customizations to that and integrations that either the vendor does or that the company itself does to extend that. So I think we have to think about this across the whole landscape.
Yeah, and there's two aspects of it, I guess, then. That's the content of the code itself, which can be scanned and so forth to find some of these things. But there's also what I guess people are calling the provenance. That is, where did it come from?
Yeah.
Who created it? Who had custody of it? Where did I buy it?
Yeah.
You really have to understand both of those aspects. And I'd like to talk about the provenance for a minute.
Yeah.
I think of supply chain management in
Yeah.
general has
Yeah.
to get around that issue. In hardware, is it a gray market? Is it a counterfeit? That's the provenance question for hardware. For software, it's, where did it actually originate and who had custody of it, I guess you could say,
Yeah.
lack of a better word. Maybe to discuss the provenance side of this whole question of risk management.
Yeah. Well, and again, it's particularly when you get into the software realm for open source software, it becomes very tricky because there can be so many contributors to
It's like a Wikipedia page
projects.
almost.
Sure. Yeah. And so software bill of materials is absolutely rising in importance. And what is the anatomy of the software that you have down to each layer? And so software bill of materials absolutely is an essential component of this. And certainly, the companies that are involved in that and the related countries and their, political alignments and so forth become very important. There are limitations. And I know that, through the Federal Acquisition Supply Chain Security Act that we saw come out in 2018, the Federal Acquisition Security Council has standards around these things and that focus on provenance and, which companies and which countries you really need to stay away from. And that really gets into software bill of materials and being able to reasonably prove the genealogy, I suppose, of the software you're looking at. I think it does, Tom, as we're thinking about this, we have to acknowledge the limitations, and we're going to have to take a belt and suspenders approach. Software bill of materials is one of those, and really understanding from your key suppliers a pillar is really expanding how you're thinking about the software supply chain as you look at your suppliers. What controls do they have embedded in their process, not only around provenance, but also control of that software supply chain beginning to end. We do, and so let's say you're doing those things well. They have their limitations. Certainly, humans are involved and we can make mistakes. Systems are flawed and those can fail in your control of your deployment. Software is so, there's not really that much of a manufacturing plant like you'd see, like in Detroit, Michigan or something. And so perhaps it's a little easier to insert, it's a little easier to insert, code into software than it is to add a chip to a physical device. I mean, you can see how it's harder. Now, all of those things are important. I think paramount to this and surrounding all of this, the software supply chain security, is the concept and the importance, because of those limitations, of a zero trust architecture, where you still need to plan for failure and how do you minimize the impact of that.
Yes, you can never get out of the need for resilience in the systems you have,
Yeah.
regardless of how much knowledge you have. And that's a good point to take a break on. We're going to come back and pull on this thread a little bit more. My guest today is Kelly White. He's the co-founder and CEO of Risk Recon, a MasterCard company. I'm Tom Temin. This is Federal Insights, software supply chain, sponsored by Risk Recon, a MasterCard company, here on Federal News Network. Welcome back to Federal Insights, software supply chain, sponsored by Risk Recon, a MasterCard company, here on Federal News Network. My guest today is Kelly White. He's the co-founder and CEO of Risk Recon, a MasterCard company. And I'm Tom Temin, host of the Federal Drive and your moderator. And before the break, we were talking about some of the limitations that the software bill of materials can actually bring to the limitations on the value it can bring to an organization trying to deal with software supply chain risk management. And I was thinking one of those limitations might be evident by the Log4j attack last year. And that is a exploit was found for just a basic utility having to do with logs of your files that no one ever thought about. It just sat there and ran. So the exploiters found a hole in something that probably nobody would think to even have a software bill of materials for. Fair way to characterize this?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I don't want to discount the value of software bill of materials. Knowing what software you're operating and what you're built on is very important. And it's actually a foundational, you really can't run your program without having that understanding of the software bill of materials. As you said, within the case of Log4j, it was very much a back-end utility component that wasn't even directly visible from the internet. So a lot of people didn't even know they were operating. They didn't know where it existed in their environment unless they had a really good software bill of materials for each of their systems, which, at the time of that vulnerability, very few had it. But it might have actually been one of the catalysts for people to start getting a handle around the software bill of materials. When you look at the Log4j vulnerability, the software bill of materials is going to tell you where Log4j exists, but it's not going to tell you, is that specifically vulnerable prior to the release of the exploit. And I think it's important we have to have humility in this space to understand that we don't know where all the vulnerabilities are in our software, whether it's a small component or the larger front-end facing system like MoveIt. So we have to operate with some humility and an expectation that we're going to have to respond quickly to these types of events as the threat landscape changes based on new vulnerabilities being discovered and then them moving into active exploit. What's important, that humility certainly leads us towards zero trust architectures. But the second point is being able to really rapidly understand and act on your risk. And knowing that in the case of Log4j, that was part of your risk surface and where it existed in your environment, companies that were in that position and were paying attention to the vulnerability landscape, though they may not have known on day 0 that they had it, but day 0+1, they could then start acting on that. What we saw across our customer base, and we're serving thousands of companies across the world to help them understand not only their own enterprise, but also their larger supply chain. And through our cybersecurity ratings and assessments platform, is that companies, the first question they asked is, where am I exposed to Log4j? They wanted to know that for their own organization, and they wanted to know that for supply chain. And the better organizations looked at multiple sources of information to triangulate on it because they're worried about what they don't know. And so through our system and our analytics, the data that we collect from the outside in, we're able to identify some indicators of systems that were running Log4j in the background. Though you couldn't see it directly, observe it directly on the internet, there were some platforms, web server versions, app servers, different things like that that are known to run it. And so just through those analytics, we're able to inform customers of their own in their own enterprise what systems appear to be running this on the internet. And then they also ask the question, well, tell me about my supply chain. Tell me about my vendors, particularly focus on those moderate and high risk suppliers. Which of my suppliers are exposed to this potentially? And then with that information, armed with that information, then they started acting, peeling back the systems in their own enterprise, correlating that with SBOM information they might have had, getting those addressed, but then actually reaching out to their suppliers where there were indicators of risk and exposure to ask them, inform them, make sure that they're aware of the issue and to understand what their response is. And that's a pattern that we see play out over and over again, that one, foundationally, that knowledge is powerful. And that's really the root of being able to respond effectively in this world that we operate in, where software is so important in controlling the operational availability and the safety and soundness of our own systems and of the systems that we've entrusted our suppliers to operate on our behalf.
And that pattern that you described then really gets to one of the essential, I think, characteristics that have to be part of supply chain risk management, especially in software, is it's not a point in time exercise. That's compliance, but it really has to be an ongoing process.
Absolutely.
Get real cybersecurity out of it.
Yeah, and that's the root of it. And again, it starts with having a really good foundational understanding of yourself and of your suppliers as much as you can. What is my risk surface? What is my attack surface? What is my software bill of materials? And with that awareness, then you're positioned to not only take proactive measures, as we've talked about, making sure that software is built securely, that the security testing is going on, but when these incidents arise, you're able to respond more rapidly and more effectively with better confidence in your coverage that, yes, we have addressed that. If you're in a spot where the worst spot to be in is you don't know what you have, you don't know what you're reliant on, and you can't respond to these things as the world changes. We see this play out time and time again. The most recent big one was MOVEit, where again, our customers who span federal and commercial and education all across many countries, when MOVEit hit, again, an essential service that we provide is informing them of where do we see MOVEit operating in their environment and also within their larger supply chain. The case with MOVEit, this was particularly important in the supply chain because so many customers of ours had suppliers who were using the MOVEit software for data transfer and so forth between, the customer and the vendor, that there was a real sense of urgency to identify where exposure was. And just having that knowledge of which of the suppliers were operating that software enabled them to rapidly engage with their vendors. And ideally, the suppliers already knew about the issue, and that's where you want to be. They already knew about it, they've responded. But again, we're in this world where belt and suspenders works. We're helping each other. We got to work together, because too often in this complex world of software and distributed services, you can't have too much information, nor does redundancy ever hurt.
Sure. And looking at this from the enterprise level and looking at the companies that you serve in the private sector, the organizations in the private sector that you serve, what are their main pain points? I mean, what is it they seek most from you? And maybe that's something the federal agencies could learn, because they're large organizations using software too, and it really doesn't matter what your financial model is or something.
Yeah. I'd say one of the biggest pain points is the use of suppliers in general. It's not just the software supply chain, but you have to magnify that software supply chain across all of your suppliers that you're contracted with, that are doing work on your behalf, that are processing data on your behalf, that are hosting systems and services on your behalf. And I think that organizations, it's challenging enough to know what's going on in your own enterprise, your own organization, and to have that strong software bill of materials, the inventory of systems, know your attack surface, and manage that estate well, where you have the benefit of full access to information and the people to influence to help improve that. When you look out to your suppliers, whether it's a supplier in the federal group agencies that might be processing passports or doing background checks on, and we've seen breaches related to this. When you look at that, those true third-party enterprises, you're at an information disadvantage inherently, because you don't have the time or the money or the access to be in their organization and have a front row seat to everything. And so Risk Recon, a MasterCard company, and others have developed ways to get good objective insights into the cybersecurity hygiene, and to some degree the internet-facing software bill of materials, and how that is being managed across a wide range of any company essentially that operates on the internet. And that information advantage in the commercial sector is very highly valued, to understand, where does my risk lie? Which suppliers have good cybersecurity hygienes? Which ones don't? Why? And what should I do about it? The supply chains, again, this word about humility that I used earlier comes back, that we truly have to be humble in our work and solving the problems that we face, and that we do need help. We do need better information. And as you said, a continuous stream of information, because one day you can end your day at work feeling pretty good, and then the next day you have the Log4j or the MoveIt situation. That DEFCON 4 type of alarm can go off at any moment.
Yeah, well, we have to leave it there. Some great insight. I want to thank today's guest is Kelly White, the co-founder and CEO of Risk Recon, a MasterCard company. Good to have you with us.
Well, thank you.
And I'm Tom Temin. You're listening to Federal News Network. For more on this presentation, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search Risk Recon.